Brother Benjamin was kind enough to swap with me. So I'll take these 2 presentations before lunch. And he will present after lunch. I want to begin with a common theme. For quite a while now, I found it very hard to begin a study without first doing reform lines. I want to explain why that is later in our classes. But if you'll begin with me here, the line of the 144,000. Ellen White gives us the Sunday law. Close of probation and the second advent. So these things we understand. And we construct 1989 and 9/11. So the reform line of the 144,000 is composed of 5 major waymarks. These 5 major waymarks divide up the steps of agriculture. They divide the ploughing from the early rain, from the latter rain, from the harvest. So these 5 major waymarks, they cut up our line into the 4 stages of the agricultural process. Everything is taking us to the harvest. There's no harvest without rain. There's no point raining on a crop if it hasn't been planted. You don't plant unless you've ploughed. So we have these 4 steps of the agricultural process. And they're cut up on our line by our 5 major waymarks. Then we understand this is the harvest of the 144,000. But we construct fractals. What we mean by this is that we have identified that God deals with His church first. He's going to deal with His church before we go to the world. So the Sunday law, we take a message to the world. The swelling of the loud cry. So before we go to the world, God must deal with His church. And He's going to do that in 3 steps. 2 for the church, 1 for the world. We could construct all of these lines. We could do the full model, draw out the Levites, draw out the Nethinims. Those 3 groups. I don't want to do that today. I want to try and cut out some noise so we can focus on the story I want to tell. So we won't draw the full lines. All that we need to see is that there is a harvest of the first group. That is the church. First for the church. After this, there is a second. A second call to the church. And after 2 calls to the church, in the Sunday law history, we finally give a call to the world. So this is what has developed in this movement over years. It's nothing new. And though I have some doubts, at least until very recently, FFA as well as ourselves accepted this model. They've seen that this model causes them some problems, particularly the harvest of the world. But this as it stands, I would suggest they all agree with. Everyone knows we harvest the world in the history of their loud cry. So what you have are 4 harvests. A harvest for the church, a second harvest for the church, a harvest for the world, and then a harvest for the 144,000. So there are 4 harvests, one after another. If there are 4 harvests, you know that there are 4 latter rain, 4 early rain, 4 ploughing dispensations. Each group has its own agricultural process. But if we can just conceptualize this, the 4 harvests. First church, and I will rewrite that. The one dispensation we are now in. We are in the first harvest period, that of the priests. So we're in this first harvest of the first group. Then we would see the harvest of the Levites. They join us. That completes the work of the church by the Sunday law. Then the world joins us. They complete their harvest by Daniel 12:1. And then there is a 4th harvest specifically for the 144,000. So this is our model. I want us to review where this came from. There's been many studies through the last 31 years that have developed this. But what is the very first study that opened up? There's one study that opened up to God's people in 1989 that became the foundation for everything that comes afterwards. Reform lines. So enough of us are well familiar with that. Reform lines opened up to God's people in 1989. And what reform lines were those? Is World War II a reform line? Is World War II a reform line? No. It's history on a line that we can place over our reform line. But there's no reform in World War II. It gives us information to understand our reform line. What do we mean when we say a reform line? It's a specific type of line. What's a reform line? If there's a need for reform, what problem do we have? God's people are in a mess. They're in captivity. They're scattered. And God needs to bring about a reformation. So we have many lines. But what opened up is quite specific. These are the reform lines that show how God brings reformation to his church. And what lines are those? There are 4 lines of reform. 2 relate to ancient Israel. And 2 relate to modern Israel. So we spoke yesterday afternoon to the sisters. We spoke about dispensations. There's 2 glorious lands. Ancient Israel and the United States. So when you talk about land, you can construct that model. But this model, ancient Israel, is God's taking his people out of Egypt, out of captivity, and he's going to restore them. And this is their alpha history. We call it the line of Moses. I don't think that's a very precise way of describing this line. I'll explain why later. But if we want to think simply, it's the line of Moses. God's people come out of Egypt. They go into the promised land. They're meant to be this peculiar people. And how do they do? You have Brother Benjamin's been talking about Leviticus 26. The blessings and the cursings. Do they choose blessing or cursing? Cursing. So how do they do in this reform line? Bad. Do they succeed? No. Without going into the history, you know that this does not end in success because they end up with the curse, not the blessing. Does that make sense? So God restores his people. He reforms them. But this does not end in success. They don't complete the work that they're supposed to do. So you must have another history, another line of reformation. They don't complete the work. They take the curse. And then God must He again finds his people in captivity. And he again is going to attempt reform. We call this the line of Christ. Again, I think that is a misleading term. But it helps us remember what history we're looking at. Does that end in success or failure? They fulfill their job function. Could Christ have come back a second time in this history? No. Paul tells us the papacy has to show itself. It has to rise up. So Christ could not come back in that time period. But he was meant to come. He was meant to die. It was complete victory over Satan. Then they were to take the message to the Gentiles. That is the job function of that dispensation. And they succeed to do that. So this is failure. It ends in the curses. This is success. They take the message to the Gentiles. That's ancient Israel. Alpha failure. Omega success. Then we come to modern Israel. Again, God's church have been in captivity. Here it's to Egypt. Here it's the period of the 1260. And God is going to restore them or reform them. This begins in 1798. And we call this the line of the Millerites. This is the beginning of modern Israel. Was Jesus meant to return in that history? Yes. So did that end in failure or success? Failure. They did not complete their mission. They go into the Laodicean condition. So they do not complete. Again, God finds his people in captivity. 126 years of it. From 1863. We come to a new line of reformation. The end of modern Israel. The final generation. The line of the 144,000. Their job function here was to take the message to the Gentiles. Our message is to take this movement to the world. Do we succeed? Yes. So this must be success. In the Alpha history, they do not complete their job function. In the Omega history, they do complete their job function. That's the difference between failure and success. And you can see that in the blessings and the cursing. So when we say in 1989, God gave this movement reform lines, they're very specific. He gave us the lines of reformation. And we have 4 of them. These are what God gave the movement. So I want to briefly review some of them. We're going to start with the line of Christ. Because the line of Christ is a history of success. They complete the work. So it's going to give us a much more whole understanding complete understanding of our reform land. This is success, this is success. There are some differences between the history of failure and this history of success. A few structural differences. And also in the message. So we'll start with what's easy. The key reform line, I would suggest, this is our number one witness. The key line that unlocks our own. Because it is a story of God reforming his people, and then they successfully do a work. We won't find that complete story in the history of failure. They go off course. So if we were to consider that reform line and place it over our own, this is the end of ancient Israel. I'll just say Omega, ancient. I might put you down on that. The end of ancient Israel. God begins that process of reform with the birth. It's the birth of John the Baptist and of Christ. So you have, at their time of the end, 4 BC, the birth. Then you're going to have the rise of John, the ministry of John. We're just going to run through these fairly quickly. You have the ministry of John. Then at 9/11, what do we mark? This is the baptism. This is the arrival of the second angel. It's the arrival of Christ. So Christ is baptized. He is introduced to that movement, but he doesn't begin to do a work. Where does he go? He goes into the wilderness for 40 days to be tempted of Satan. So he goes into the wilderness, he comes out, he goes to the marriage of Cana. His mother comes to him and asks him to do something for her. And what is his response? My time has not yet come. So has Christ taken leadership of that movement? Begun his work? No. So you have Cana, and you know he has not begun that work. Then we come down to when he begins. How does he begin his work? The first temple cleansing. The first temple cleansing begins his ministry. So from here forward, you have the work of Christ. He takes leadership of that movement. The disciples must stop following John and start following Christ. This was all the calling of that first group. Those disciples, they're trained under John. Many of them are baptized by John. Not all. Then they learn to follow Christ. They change their allegiance from the first angel, John, to the second angel, Christ. From the first leader, John, to the second leader, Christ. John has one problem. He's raised up. He doesn't get trained by the Pharisees, but he still takes on much of their old ideas. This is the problem Parminder was discussing this morning. They take on the ideas of the leadership of the church. They bring into the movement those misunderstandings. So John the Baptist, he talks about the generation of vipers, meaning the Pharisees and the church leaders. He condemns them. But what does he say is about to happen? The Messiah has come. And what does that Messiah look like? An earthly king, which is exactly the message of the Pharisees. So he takes elements of the message of that time, the Laodicean message of the Pharisees, and he blends it with his own. So his own message is half truth, half what God has given him, and the other half is the Laodicean message that he's blended it with. The time has come. The Messiah is here. He will restore his people. Truth. But he's going to be an earthly king, defeat the Romans, restore the Jewish nation as church and state. Wrong. And he took that from the Laodicean church of his time. So there are problems with John's message. So these disciples are all trained under John. Then they are told, I must decrease, he must increase. And they learn they must follow the second angel. And what does Jesus start telling them? I've got nowhere to lay my head. I've got no glory to give you. There's no greatest position. I'm here to serve. I'm going to die on a tree. He's telling the disciples who he is, what his mission is. And most of them, you could say all of them to different degrees, are not listening. You come down to the upper room, just before the cross. Then there's a problem. The disciples, their feet are dusty, and there's supposed to be some servant come and humiliate themselves, kneel, and wash the feet of the guests. But no servant has come. So Jesus, he gives them one final lesson before the cross. They've held on to the kingdom of John. Christ has tried to tell them, my kingdom is not what John led you to believe it was. But they're not listening. So he's going to demonstrate it. And Christ, who is meant to be this earthly monarch, he kneels down, he's girded himself, and he washes their feet. And he's telling them what his kingdom is going to be like. 11 of them struggle with this, but they start to get the message. One of them understands perfectly, but does he accept it? No. Judas, he looks at Christ and he says, if that's the kingdom you're giving me, I don't accept it. I want earthly glory. John promised me earthly glory. I want the kingdom that the first angel promised me. And he leaves the table. He falls away before the cross. Do you remember Elder Parminder's studies? He did it, I think, more in the last camp meeting. People leave before the cross. People leave in the Sunday law history before the shut door. And that's Judas. All those who, through their loyalty to the first angel, their love of the kingdom he promised, do not learn to accept the second. So you have the first test to the church. The first test is for the disciples. They are the ones tested at the cross. The disciples are scattered. We won't go into a description of this history. I covered that history in the last camp meeting. I want to make some different points. But this is a time of testing for the first group. Once the disciples get their act together, what do? They take a message back to the church. So the first group is the disciples. The second group goes back to the church at Pentecost. This is the harvest of the second group of the church. The Jewish nation has a second opportunity to hear the gospel. Those called at Pentecost were all Jews. This was not a call to Gentiles. These were Jews who had been scattered in foreign lands. Many of them had not had the opportunity to meet with Christ. So there's these two testing times, these two harvests for the Jewish nation, the end of their history. First, the disciples, they join the movement prior to the shut door. Then at the cross they're tested. They get their act together, become fit for purpose. When they have done that, they go back to the church at Pentecost. There's a few years where the church has an opportunity, the Jewish nation. And then in 34 AD, the gospel is no longer restricted to the Jewish nation, and it goes to the Gentiles. 34 AD lines up with the Sunday law. We go to the world, they went to the Gentiles. The gospel is no longer restricted to Adventism. The gospel was no longer restricted to the Jewish nation. So in these 3 steps, these 3 harvests, you can see at that history of success, they perfectly model our reform line. And they finish the work that they're designed to do in that history. Does that make sense? I just want to make a point. These reform lines, specifically these 4 key lines, the 3, and then our application of the 3, began to open in 1989 for a very specific reason. And that reason is that they undergird everything else this movement teaches. It's all built on these reform lines. Everything else just becomes another layer, giving more information. But it's built on this concept. Then of those reform lines, there is one that is the key. Christ. Because this is success, explaining our history of success. When we construct that whole history, the job that they're designed to do is to take the gospel to the Gentile world. They complete that. Before completing that, the Jewish nation is given an opportunity twice. First in the history of Christ, the calling of the disciples, and then in the history of Pentecost, all those who hadn't had sufficient opportunity. So twice to the church, once to the world. This model is watertight. It cannot be moved. I hope we see that. Can any one of these points of history be budged from their position? No. You can't wrench one of them. You can't move Pentecost. You can't move 34 AD. It's watertight. When you do that, you recognize that there is a first angel and a second angel. Now, Ellen White tells us John led the movement. People that did not listen to him did not listen to Christ. Because there is a transition in leadership. First angel, second angel. First angel has problems in his message, but that is taken from the Laodicean Jewish nation. Second angel has to correct those mistakes. Are there any mistakes in the message of the second angel? No. If you can see no, just know that on that fact alone, on this 20 minutes of evidence alone, you can never come into agreement with FFA. All of those in the movement currently sharing their concepts of liberalism. To be safe in this history, all you need to see, that point alone will anchor you to the truth if you trust it. We want to add more evidence, but we shouldn't need it if we can see it in this history. First angel, second angel, mistakes in the first, corrected in the second. A half-wrong understanding of the nature of this kingdom. A completely accurate understanding of the nature of this kingdom. And this transition in leadership occurs before the first group face their test. So this transition in leadership, did it happen before 2019 or after 2019? It has to be before. What Elder Jeff now teaches is that the change in leadership will happen at Pentecost. What's the problem with that? You can't justify that on any reform line. Everyone who leaves this movement, the first subject they must attack is the subject of reform lines. So when Elder Jeff separated from this movement and he started to attack, particularly Elder Parminder and myself, he would go into inspiration. He'd take a story. He would take a story of apostasy in the wilderness, of a man and a woman that brings sin into the camp, and how Moses had to take action and they had to die. So he's going to take that story. He's going to make application. Elder Parminder and myself, a man and a woman, brought apostasy into the movement. We deceived you all, made you all sin. And now he must stand up as the leader and have us killed. Wipe out that apostasy. And he would say, he wouldn't say, but he indicates, and he certainly acts like it, that to cleanse apostasy, any tactic is acceptable. If in ancient times those persons should be killed, then there is no restraint on what he will say or do to destroy the trust of the people in Elder Parminder or myself. So constantly I'm finding out new things about myself. Apparently, Elder Parminder, he isn't satanic. He is a devil, literally a devil, that has taken human form. Not someone possessed. Literally a devil. And the problem with that, our question back to those sharing those ideas, is that he has children. So how did that happen? Apparently, that to do this work, I was forced to separate from my boyfriend. That's one story. The other story they tell is that I am a lesbian. Their theories contradict. I never had a boyfriend. Not lesbian. I'm not lesbian. But there's these constant attacks and conspiracy theories. They teach that I am mentally unwell, autistic. These conspiracy theories are mixed with personal slander, stories that are misrepresented to try and kill Elder Parminder and myself. Not literal death, but destroy our character and reputations. And they're frankly not true. They even their stories even contradict. But this is their position. Any means is justifiable. They have to cleanse the camp of Israel from a man and a woman who brought sin into the camp. We don't respond with personal slander. I won't even stop calling him Elder Jeff. I will call him my elder, even if he says I'm an autistic false prophet. I won't add all the things underneath, because we don't need their tactics. We would not use those methods. We don't need to use those methods, because what anchors us in this movement is not any of their bad behaviour, it's reform lines. So when he attacks our character, I have no response except to come back to reform line and say, explain this. And when he says, Elder Parminder and myself are fulfilling that Old Testament story, my problem with that is not the personal attacks, is that he's taking this story, this is his story, and he's cutting it out of a reform line. There is a whole history that belongs to the beginning of ancient Israel. This is a reform line. This is a reform line. This story is not a reform line. So their tactic is to cut the reform line up. Take one story out of its context and apply it, because it fits their narrative. So you will never see them teach this. They can't. Instead, they will take one story and apply it. And they'll call that line upon line. But it is not line upon line, because they've had to cut it out of its reform line. That story of apostasy, if you put it in its reform line, belongs in the history of 9/11 to 2014 in the wilderness. That's where that story belongs, if you don't cut it. But he's going to cut it and apply it to our shut door time period. He's going to go literal to literal. Man, woman, man, woman. Make a literal application. Take it from its reform line, cut it, and put it where they feel it fits. I won't respond with slander. I will respond with the methodology God gave us at the time of the end. In this way, Mark, the Sunday law for the first group, there is a transition in leadership from the first to the second. And there is no justifiable argument to place the transition of leadership at Pentecost. So coming back to here, this transition that happens well before the test for the first group, which lines up directly with November 9 last year. This transition, if we were to do the story leading to this test, this shut door for the first group belonging to the church, this lines up directly with the cross. This is the waymark of the cross. I want to just mention two passages. Mark 1:14 and early writings 1:5-4. Point 1. So in Mark 1:14 says that after John was put in prison, Jesus came into Galilee, preaching the gospel of the kingdom of God. So in verse 13, it talks about Christ is in the wilderness, he's tempted of Satan, he's fed by angels. Verse 14, John is put in prison, Jesus comes preaching the gospel. I know that's an oversimplification, but it's marking a transition, this change, as Jesus begins his work and John becomes silent. Back to early writings. John informed his disciples that Jesus was the Messiah. As his work was closing, well before 2019, he taught his disciples to look to Jesus and to follow Jesus. John's life was one of self-denying. He heralded the first advent. But what was not permitted to witness the miracles of Christ. John knew something. He knew this. When Jesus should be established as a teacher, John knew that he must die. So as Jesus becomes established, John knows that he must die. And this all occurs before the cross, the death of John. So this is one history. You mark a transition. I'll put references down here. You mark a transition from the first leader to the second leader. There is John to Christ. And then at this point, John is imprisoned, then he dies. All before the shut door for the first group. I'll give you the Desire of Ages quote as well, where she tells us, John did not understand the nature of Christ's kingdom. This was his problem. Didn't understand the nature. Another quote. CC 319.2. This is for your own study. This quote tells us how Judas was offended when Christ demonstrated in foot washing the nature of his kingdom. Where Judas realized that if Jesus would humble himself in such a fashion, could not be Israel's king, could not be what John promised him. So this is our key reform line, the line of Christ. I want us to briefly look at the other two. The line of Millerites and the line of Moses. So this is the Amiga of ancient Israel. We're not dealing with these in order. We'll briefly look at the Alpha of modern Israel. Now there's a difference in these Alpha histories where they don't complete the work. They start having problems fairly early on in that reform line. But we can still see the same modelled structure. This work of Reformation, the beginning of modern Israel, it began in 1798. God is going to call out that first group of people. This is the work of William Miller. He represents the first angel. He gives a message. It's an increase of knowledge. It's formalized. And then it's tested. Here at 9/11. Here. August 11, 1840. We know that we also mark April 19 here. I'm not going to go through their full reform line in detail, but just enough so that we can see the pattern. Time of the end, God raises up a messenger. His message is tested. This is the restraint of Islam. It lines up with the restraint of Islam. But then we have the disappointment. We also line up April 19. They go into the wilderness. There is this time period after April 19 of tarrying. So this is all from the parable of the 10 virgins. We mark here a tarrying time, just as we do after 9/11. So we mark time of the end, 1798, work and message of the first angel, a testing time, a tarrying time. What takes them out of that tarrying time? there's a relative nobody who starts studying the autumn feasts. His name is Samuel Snow. And he starts to write about his studies, sharing his understanding that Christ would come. The history of October. He writes them down. They're known as Samuel Snow's letters. Back here. Before Boston. Before that camp meeting, where the midnight cry first begins, he writes about them in his letters. So this is just another thought, adding a detail into this history. You have Samuel Snow speaking before the midnight cry begins to swell, which we line up with 2014, which is Sunday law, which is the beginning of the swelling of the loud cry. I'm not going to prove it. I'm just putting it in here. Elder Parminda began to come into controversy with this movement, with the leadership, in 2012, when he already introduced time setting, and it was rejected. Samuel Snow spoke before Boston. The leadership was already either rejecting or ignoring him. But here we mark Boston. It's going to swell to Concord, and then finally to Exeter, which is their midnight cry. All before their shut door of October 22, 1844. This is all one group of people. One group called, trained under Miller, tarry, listen to Samuel Snow, are there for the swelling of the midnight cry, and then face the shut door. That's one group. You don't find a second group in that history. So this all relates to the first. The 10 virgins. Just as the disciples. So where is the change of leadership? Is it safe for people to be following William Miller in the history of August to October? No. There's a change of leadership from Miller to Snow. Change of leadership from John to Christ. Then the second angel speaks. Change of leadership from Miller to Snow. Then the second angel speaks. And then they're tested. And this is all just one group. All lining up with our shut door. So the cross, in its primary application, is November 9 last year. That symbol enough explains so much of our experience over the last 18 months. October 22. It's that first shut door. It also explains much of our experience. But we must acknowledge it is a history of failure. So I want to make the point. October 22 lines up with November 9, 2019. We'd identified October 22 to be a shut door experience. But then we also know over here in 1950 they're taking their message to the world. So can this be Daniel 12:1 for their history? Sorry. Can October 22 be Daniel 12:1 for their reform line? It can't be. After Daniel 12:1, you don't take the gospel to the world. It's all done by then. So October 22 cannot be the final shut door for their history. We must identify there is a fractal in their history. That you have two groups. Without proving it, I'm going to say that a difference between an alpha and an omega history is that you do not have three groups. You can only identify two. That's one of the few structural differences between an alpha history and an omega history. There's a shut door here. But 1850, they print the 1850 chart and they take the gospel to the world. And then I believe most are familiar with our understanding of 1861, the beginning of the Civil War, which was the judgment of God. I would suggest you start seeing the activity of the plagues. So that aside, you can see that they're doing a work here for the world with the 1850 chart. So this shut door is a fractal. It's the first group of people. And it lines up with October 22. These reform lines, at each point, in so many ways, the same reform lines God gave us in 1989 show that what FFA are teaching and their chosen teachers is utter foolishness. Example, October 22 is November 9, 2019. They teach November 9, 2019, Christ stood up and stopped intercession for that first group. If you're going to apply that here, you have to apply it to them. So let's start lining up our pioneers. James and Ellen White. Joseph Bates. You could keep going. Smith. All of these people. Maybe not Smith. All of those people, they face their shut door here. To be consistent, we would have to teach that their probation closed here, intercession stopped. And we hope that Ellen White never did another wrong thing in her life. In the next 60 plus years of her life, 70 years, because she lived 70 years after 1844, she never once asked God's forgiveness. Because she couldn't. Because from this date forward, when you have a shut door and it's a hard close of probation, there is no intercession. So our pioneers never required God's forgiveness after October 22. Can you see the problem? Can anyone not get that point? FFA teaches that this November 9 shut door is a hard close of probation. It's Daniel 12:1. It's the ceasing of all intercession. This is a shut door in the same model as October 22. Both are a shut door for the first group. Both relate to a fractal. And if you're going to say that this is a hard close of probation, Christ was meant to come back in their history, this must have been a hard close of probation for the first group. And if we believe that, then all of our pioneers had no intercessor. From October 22, 1844, until the day they died. For Ellen White, that's 71 years, where she never once asked God's forgiveness, where she never once had any sin. Not just her, every single pioneer that went through that history. It's not defendable on a reform line, which is why reform lines keep us safe. There's other quotes that relate to this history. One of the ones I find most significant is Early Writings 260.1. This is for your own study. This quote, it speaks about the rejection, the Protestant rejection of the prophecies. And she lines up that Protestant rejection up to October 22 with the crucifixion of Christ. So this passage by Early Writings, it's really useful. She's going to line up these, really compare and contrast the rejection of Christ with the rejection, particularly of the 2300 days. So she'll say the rejection of Christ crucifying him is equal to rejecting the 2300 days and the time prophecies. She will say, as the Jews crucified Jesus, so the Protestant churches crucified the Millerite message. They claimed to love Jesus, but Jesus decided he would test them. If you don't think you would have crucified me, let's see how you respond to the 2,300 day time prophecy. They're equal. Just want to make a point. People today struggle with the message, particularly what I teach, Because they suggest there's not enough of Jesus in it. I want to reiterate the point I made yesterday with the sisters. Lots of people claim to love Christ, claim to trust him, claim that they would never have crucified him. I would suggest that for thousands of years, whether you want to look at the 1260, the persecutions, you could look at the Crusades, you could look at the American South, go through 6,000 years and see how many awful things, how many actions of murder, abuse, genocide have been done in the name of God. That's the reason there are so many atheists today. So many people who hate God because they say, see what people have done in the name of God. It's easy to say we wouldn't crucify him, that we love him. But when we don't know what he looks like, we make him in our own image. So the American South thinks God is this white man. They make him this Western white person that does not agree with history. We make God in our own image, where we don't accept his nature, his character. So we can say we love him all we like. God will test us to see if we know him. And he tested them with the 2300 days. And people could argue, where is Christ in the 2300-day prophecy? And the answer is, if you knew what he looked like, you would see him. But you don't know what he looks like. That prophecy lines up with the crucifixion, lines up with the test of equality. It equals rejecting equality. People argue, where is Jesus in these prophecies? Where is Jesus in the message of equality between race and gender? I would give them the same answer. If you knew what he looked like, you wouldn't ask that question. But our problem is, we claim to love him, as did one church for 1260 years. But we don't know what he looks like. So he tests us. Do we know him? When we see what he's like, can we still love him? Or when he comes in a form we can't recognize, like he did for the Jews, like he did for the Protestants, like he did for FFA, can we still love him? Or do we say, this isn't the Christ I expected, or here, or here? Can we not recognize his character? There's no point claiming to love someone when all we're loving is the reflection of ourselves that we've placed on him. When we make him in our own image, that's called loving yourself, not loving God, because he doesn't look like what we thought he looked like even 2 years ago. He gives us a revelation of his character, and that tests whether or not we actually love his character. We'll close now and have a break. When we come back, I just want to review. We've done the line of the Omega of ancient Israel. This one that relates directly to our own. The Alpha of modern Israel. That while being failure, also tells us of our end. Then we'll discuss the history of Moses. If you kneel with me, we'll close in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for our blessings. Thank you for this new day. We know, Lord, that the camp is rapidly coming to completion. Our time together is short. I pray, Lord, that you will bless our fellowship, bless our studies, bless our interaction around these studies. Lord, we want to be established in these truths so that nothing can shake us. We want to be founded upon the rock. We look back as we see how you have led us, not just us, but your people over 6,000 years. We identify the histories you've given us to learn from. I pray, Lord, we'll find ourselves anchored in them, that we will not be shaken. In Jesus' name, amen.